Good morning, Derek. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to hear your views about responsible tourism in South Africa. You were a former Minister of Tourism in South Africa and a long-standing activist in the ANC, and you still are. Can you tell us something about your engagement with tourism when you were a minister? How important was it to the realisation of a post-apartheid, more just and equal society?
Well, I must say those years of being a minister of tourism were particularly fulfilling and rewarding. I had been a minister of various portfolios before then, and immediately before becoming Minister of Tourism, I was the Minister of Science and Technology, which was very stimulating and was very useful. But in being appointed as Minister of Tourism, I discovered a new world and really discovered not that I hadn't always enjoyed tourism, and travel has always been a passion that I have had, but I discovered the real benefits and widespread benefits of tourism. And I also got to know an industry of really passionate people who are keen not only to do their little bit, but to make a broader contribution to the economy, to society, and to environmental protection. So it was a rich period, and of course a period during which I would like to believe I was able to make some contribution towards taking tourism to greater heights. We had our own limiting factors during that 5-year period, but it was I believe that we made good progress during that period, and for me personally it was very fulfilling.
You were a very visible and a very popular Minister of Tourism. I'm sure people would like to know what you're up to now, Derek.
Well, thank you for that. I was just simply trying to do my best to serve an industry, and an industry of, as I said already, an industry with massive potential to create jobs and to create livelihoods and to bring benefits to people. So it came very naturally to me. Last year we had our general elections in South Africa, and I have not returned to Parliament. I actually resigned from Parliament, so I'm not in cabinet at the moment as we speak. However, President Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, has appointed me as what we call a special envoy in the presidency, with a focus on investment, an investment envoy, and in particular investment in tourism. So right now, because of COVID-19, there's really isn't much happening, but that is the current position that I hold and responsibility that I take. So I haven't moved away from the sector. I'm in perhaps Harold semi-retirement, and I do other things besides my bit of government work in the presidency. I do work with NGOs, but I am in semi-retirement, so I can now become a tourist myself and do more traveling myself, and that I look forward to. In addition to promoting and assisting potential investors, I will obviously continue simply to promote tourism and to give it a boost wherever I can.
Thanks for that, Derek. Can I take you back to the immediate post-apartheid period? I think it's fair to say that the ANC didn't have a policy in '94 on what it was going to do with tourism, but that led in 1996 to the famous white paper, which was actually the first government document in the world to talk about the importance of responsible tourism. How much progress do you think has been made using tourism to make South Africa a better place to live in, through creating jobs, through local supply chains, through empowering local communities? How do you see it in retrospect?
Yeah, well, firstly, you're right. I mean, we didn't have a detailed policy document prior to the first elections in 1994. The ANC didn't have detailed policy positions. So the 1996 white paper was very significant. And interestingly, Harold, it has stood the test of time. It is still there, almost 25 years later, as a foundational document, as a point of departure. So we've had various strategies, very specific strategies, broader strategies, legislation passed since then over the last 24, 25 years. But the foundation document remained the 1996 white paper, whereas you have often recognized that it was a pioneering piece of work, in the sense that it gave the sort of full recognition to the need for more responsible tourism practices, more sustainable tourism, and it highlighted that. And in that sense, I think it was a groundbreaker. What progress have we made since then? Well, two answers to that, two quick ones. And one is quite a lot, and the other one is not enough. So
that's what I expected you to say, Derek.
So what we have is really outstanding and inspiring examples of people doing the responsible thing at their lodges, at their guest houses. So, and that is countrywide. So we have many stories to tell of people who are reaching out to communities, who are accredited under Fair Trade for Tourism, people who are doing outstanding environmental work with local communities. So great inspiring examples, if you like. But on the other hand, just as you expected me to say, we need more of it. We need more people to embrace and accept that responsibility. That and if there's something called enlightened self-interest, to accept that in forging sustainable and healthy relationships with local communities, in working better with their own employees, in looking after the environment better, they are actually looking after their own longer-term interests as businesses.
One of the things which the social anthropologists tell us about Africa, and I'm sure you know this, Derek, is that it is the most culturally diverse continent by a long way. And I'm passionate about Africa because of that. And I've seen maybe a third of Africa. There's so much of it, so much diversity. And within countries, incredible diversity. I mean, one of the most moving experiences I've had in South Africa is visiting Constitution Hill. And I don't understand why more tour operators don't take people there to see the multi-languages and the multi-ethnicity and the multiculturalism, which is inherent in the South African concept of democracy and justice. And that the consequence of that for tourism, it seems to me, Derek, is it's rather boring in South Africa unless you get away from the mainstream operators, because the wine routes, the Table Mountain and so on, they're great attractions in their own right, but increasingly people want that cultural experience, that engagement with local people. And some people are doing that in South Africa, but still many people in the industry are not.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have this incredibly diverse offer. So we do have the scenic beauty, we do have the wildlife, we have mountains and rivers and coastline and all of that. But we also have a rich cultural offer, and we have obviously a liberation history, which is quite unique in the world. So its Constitution Hill sort of represents the shift away from the system of colonial rule and apartheid rule towards a fair dispensation, towards democracy, and in bringing everybody behind that dream and achieving it. And so you're right. I mean, we need to showcase these things, but at the same time, Harold, we the owners of these establishments, if you like, or even the managers of World Heritage sites like Robben Island, the cradle of humankind, by the way. Yeah. You say you've seen a third of Africa, but your own ancestors come from Africa.
Indeed.
And we in South Africa have the best living experience of where we all come from, of our early ancestry, just because of the numerous fossil finds that are to be found in Marupeng at the cradle of humankind. But we need to make the experience a more exciting experience. So, for example, Robben Island is sort of gradually, over the passage of time, losing its attraction to a lot of people, because it's a bit long ago that Nelson Mandela was incarcerated on Robben Island. But we could do much more to make it a sort of an exciting, memorable experience. Go out there and relive it and understand it. So we need to make these places that are obviously very important to us as a nation and could be a very exciting and unboring tourism experience, but we need to make it a more alive experience, if you like, and a more profound experience. So part of it is not just up to the tour operators to include that in their itineraries, but to do the necessary things to make them have to include it in the itineraries, because that's where people want to go to, because it is such a profound experience.
Derek, I must share with you something that happened for me last time I was in South Africa, which was for WTM Africa last year. And I was taken out to dinner in a local restaurant in one of the townships. And what was striking was the first time, I normally do that whenever I'm in South Africa. I normally go and have at least one meal in a township. But what was extraordinary this time was a couple turned up in an Uber, had made their own booking direct on the telephone. And suddenly you realise that tourism has moved on a whole other stage in South Africa, where tourists, I think they were Italians, had actually booked their own restaurant out of the guidebook, taken an Uber and arrived for supper. That wasn't happening 5 years ago. It's a big change when that begins to happen.
Yes, that's great. It's good to hear. And there are some really excellent restaurants and tourist experiences to be had in townships, if you like. I mean, Soweto is one example. It happens to be, well, it's the biggest single township with a history in South Africa, with a very rich history. But also one street in the township of Soweto is a street where two Nobel Peace Prize winners lived just up the road from each other, Archbishop Tutu and Nelson Mandela. So it is quite unique. But in going to Vilakazi Street, there's a great vibe there, and there are a couple of excellent restaurants. And what we're seeing is it's starting as a core area, and sort of things are growing around it. What you've seen also in Soweto is guest houses opening up, backpackers. There's something called Lebo's Backpacker that has really made a name for itself, because it's in particular, it's attracting young people from all over the world who want the tourism experience, but they also want the kinds of things that young people like all over the world, and they're getting it at this backpacker. And it's a very safe experience as well, because there's still, Harold, you've been to South Africa many times, and you know the places that are safe and not so safe, etc. But there is that fear and concern. So, that reassurance has to be there. As it happens, when you go to Lebo's Backpack or other places, you are pretty much as safe as you would be in any tourism place anywhere in the world. So there have been very, very few incidents around those areas, as the case may be.
I must say, Derek, that I felt more fear in other tourist destinations around the world than I ever have in a township in South Africa. There are problems for tourists wherever they travel to. Can I take you back to, Derek, to one of the areas where I think there are still some problems, and get your views on this? One of the things which happened around the land restoration movement post-apartheid was that various agencies of government, whether they were provinces or national government, invested in lodges and community assets which were intended to secure an income for communities from tourism. And that absolutely fits with the white paper. It's a great strategy. And to some extent it's worked, but they've struggled. And they've struggled because often they weren't built in the best places. They weren't built by people who knew how to make tourism work. You've now got in South Africa quite a big investment in that kind of asset. And I'm quite concerned, really, that in the context of COVID, with this terrible turning down in the visitor arrivals, that these places are really going to struggle over the next year or two. What's your view on this, Derek, and about what might be done to help them through this very difficult period?
Thanks, Harold. If I could just take you back one step, because not everybody is necessarily aware of what this restoration of land process is about in South Africa, and I'm not going to dwell long on it, but given during the apartheid period, a lot of people were dispossessed of their land. People were forcibly removed off their land, and so in our constitution, there's an obligation and a right for people who were the victims of these forced removals to reclaim their land. And a special court was set up, and a restitution commission was set up. So a number of claims were lodged, and a number of those claims were successfully resolved. So people either got cash compensation or they got the actual piece of land restored to them. So that is what we're talking about here, Harold. And interestingly, it offers opportunity because the land effectively now belongs to the successfully claiming communities, And in some cases, what has happened on that land has been good, successful, and sustainable, and really has been kind of win-win, if you like. I'll give you one example. A group of people called the Makuleke, who lived adjacent to the Kruger National Park, successfully claimed 25,000 hectares, actually 50,000 hectares. 25,000 of those hectares were inside the Kruger National Park. The additional 25,000 hectares expanded the boundary of the Kruger National Park, and the outcome was expanded conservation area. The community obtained ownership of the land, but part of a conservation area. All assets on that land, as in lodges and any economic assets, would belong to the community, but the Conservation Authority remained the South African National Parks Board. And so big lodges have been established on that piece of land on the northern end of the Kruger National Park, running today, many years later, running very successfully. So the big question is, but I think in answer to your question, there are also other cases where people, in their desperation, who not only on restored land, but other land that might be called tribal land or customary land, have tried to establish lodges or have established lodges with government assistance, and there's been quite a high failure rate. So the real question is, what do we learn out of that? How can we do it differently, so that we have a high success rate? And what are the essential ingredients to achieving those successes? I think the reflection from my side, Harold, is that it really lies in collaboration and partnership. For people who are out in the rural areas, and often in places that offer wonderful tourism opportunities, beautiful places, beautiful sites, but the community itself has no tourism experience, and often the market research hasn't been done, and often the places are quite remote, so that access becomes a challenge. So there are a number of factors that mitigate against or really impede the success of the project. But the critical one is in the conceptualization of the project itself, and putting in place the essential ingredients at an early stage. So if I started off by saying partnerships are critical. The partner brings in capital, the partner brings in experience, the partner brings in access to markets, but the partner also takes risk, which if the state simply funds the establishment of a lodge or a tourism facility, the state doesn't take any risk. It's taxpayers' money, it's written off. A private sector partner will not easily take that risk, will want to be quite sure that he or she will get a good return or reasonable return on investment. So our learning is that do that at an early stage. Do that at an early stage. Don't say, well, yes, yeah, this sounds like a good plan. Here's the money for your plan. And once you've built the lodge, then we see if we can find a suitable operator for the lodge. It doesn't work that way, because the lodge in itself may have been, had the partnership been established at an early stage, the lodge may have been constructed differently. It may have been put in a different place. And so, that experience would be brought in early stage rather than late stage. The late stage becomes a rescue operation. And that's what we should be avoiding. I want to give you one more, Harold. Forgive me for dwelling on this, because I believe
this is a really important issue, Derek. You're completely
okay, because I also believe it offers great opportunity, because there are many other pieces of land with high potential out there in the rural areas, where actually there's little other potential economic activity. There's a bit of agriculture, but probably the best employment potential lies in tourism development in some of those areas. So I want to give you an example of a particularly beautiful part of our South African landscape, and that is the Wild Coast. Pristine piece of coastline. And the example there is of a company called Wilderness Safaris. You would know Colin Bell very well, because he has, he's been a speaker on at one of your events. But that was a few years ago, and they took the plunge, Colin and a few partners, and they entered into a partnership which happened over a number of years with the local community, who were also successful land claimants. on that Wild Coast area, on the Wild Coast, and they are right now. They are at the stage of building what they call an affordable 5-star hotel. It was only COVID-19 that stopped them from doing it. The benefit to the community is that they own the land. They get rent on the land whether the business succeeds or doesn't. Even now during COVID-19, they are getting their rent on that land. They will get a lease, they will get a percentage of revenue, not just a percentage of profit, but a percentage of turnover throughout the life of that business. So it's sustainable. The opportunity was there because the community held the land, owned the land, and the community was desperate for some, high levels of unemployment, desperate for developing their economic potential and offering jobs, etc. And so, there was a sort of a synergy of interests. And there are many, many other sites where this could be done. But I would suggest, without going into the detail of this particular case, that we have models that show success. And we should try to not being able to do them identically or wanting to do them identically, but we can replicate these models. And the opportunities are out there. It's a matter of getting them right from the outset.
I agree with all of that, but there are a number, aren't there, which were clearly wrong at the outset by location, yes, or partnership and so on, in which the state taxpayers in South Africa have invested a great deal of money. Do you think they're going to survive this COVID crisis?
Well, it's not just those businesses that are struggling.
No, they all are.
This COVID crisis.
Yeah, of course.
All businesses are. Some of those businesses were struggling before COVID anyway. Some of those specific businesses that you're talking about, precisely because they were wrongly conceptualized in the first place, either built in the wrong places or built in the wrong way, and don't have a good operator, don't necessarily offer what tourists are looking for. And that's the essential thing. Offer what tourists are looking for and make sure that you're able to provide it. So in those cases some of these projects are successful, I should say, of lodges that have been built with taxpayers' money, and they're running successfully. However, as I said earlier, a number of them, in fact, the majority of them are not. So some of them will unfortunately simply have to be exited. At the moment, as we speak, the Department of Tourism is in the process of a rescue operation for a lot of these establishments and bringing in partners. So some of them can be rescued. They're not necessarily in totally wrong places. They need an injection of capital. They need to be linked with marketing networks, and they need to be better managed, and they can be successful. But as I said before, we don't want to get there again. We want to continue with giving support to community initiatives and getting more tourism activity going in the deeper rural areas, more remote rural areas, but to do it in the right way, right from the beginning.
It just seems to me, Derek, it would be really unfortunate for those communities who had a long-term experience of building those businesses if, as a consequence of COVID, which is none of their fault, obviously, if they lose that community asset. It just seems to me that it's going to be almost a tragedy. If that happens. But there are, of course, many businesses which will not survive COVID-19 in my own country as well as in South Africa. It's a big crisis.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but it is interesting to examine the effect of COVID and to analyze it. It's in the same way. It's a bit of the same as you find in agriculture. Large plantations, large farms. And many people believe that you have to be large in order to make sufficient profit, and it's about economies of scale, etc. But often it's the smaller farming units that are more resilient because there are often more than one stream of income. Same in tourism, I should say, Harold, that many of the smaller businesses, it's firstly the guest house is often the place where you live anyway. So even if you've had to temporarily shut down because of COVID-19, that's your house.
Yeah.
and you would have some staff, and so you retain some staff. So the reduction of staff, which is obviously has been a response in South Africa to the temporary closure of businesses, has been the reduction of people working in those businesses. Smaller businesses have reduced less of their staff than bigger businesses, interestingly enough.
Yeah, so often they're family members, of course, in those smallest guest house experiences.
Exactly.
In any event. One of the things which interests me, I think, is how can those larger, more established businesses help with the development of tourism in the rural areas and also facilitate better experiences for travellers who are visiting the townships? Do you think there is a responsibility on the large operators to do that?
Yes, definitely there is. Interestingly, I mean, the responses of some of the larger businesses to this COVID-19 situation that we find ourselves in, it's been a wake-up call for many people. Obviously, it is a crisis. It's a crisis that of threatened business closure, where the business will not be able to survive it, and of course, an immediate crisis of people having lost their jobs, and so it's big, and big job losses have occurred. Just on responses to it, though, if you're talking about people who businesses, tourism businesses who are really serious about doing responsible tourism, interestingly, those very same businesses are doing the responsible thing now in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Grootbos, for example, which has won numerous prizes, awards by yourself, for the kinds of things that they're doing with the local community and with the environment, are feeding 2,000 people a day, providing 2,000 meals a day in the local township. So that's what they're doing. So people, of course, some people have been retrenched, and of course there's a closure of their business, but they're continuing and they're doing the right thing. And in speaking to Michael Lutzaya, he said, well, actually, that's a wake-up call for them as well, because post-COVID-19, they're going to continue providing these meals to hungry people in the township, in addition to offering the jobs that they offer people. So do I believe bigger businesses, more established businesses, have the opportunity to, or have the responsibility to assist in township tourism development and assist smaller establishment? The answer is an emphatic yes, because that's the nature of collaboration and the nature of coexisting, if you like. So instead of regarding the emerging business as competition, regard it as opportunity, regard it as diversification, and grow with the smaller business. Become a partner to the smaller business from the outset, and see and recognize that in developing the tourism potential of the township, you're further developing the tourism offer that South Africa has. So you're developing the unexploited and unexplored opportunities that are begging to be exploited and developed.
I think you're absolutely right there, Derek. The notion that you can enrich the potential tourist experience of a destination and get extended length of stay by working with local communities to create a richer tourist experience, including, for example, the cultural experience or the sport experience in the case of Grootbos, is very powerful. And people like Porter from Harvard Business School have recognized the importance in modern capitalism of creating shared value. But, I look at South Africa, Derek, and I see Grootbos and I see Spear, and then I begin to run out of examples of big companies who are doing it. And they almost need to step up to the plate, don't they?
Yeah, well, they do. I mean, I can mention other examples, obviously, but right back to where we were with your earlier question, is there enough of it? No, there isn't. So they need to step up to the plate. I really believe that this COVID-19 crisis has made South Africans, including business owners, much more aware of the depth of the social challenges that we have in South Africa, and the fact that we're in this together. Right now, people are responding, and that is quite heartening, the way people are responding. But it's also it's a recognition that the problems of poverty, inequality, hunger were there before, and they will be there after, and we don't want it to be that way. And it's in the interest of everyone. The haves have very much in their interest to do better, to provide for the have-nots, the state has to take more responsibility and come up with more effective measures to address these problems of poverty and inequality. And the private sector has to play a much more active role in addressing these imbalances. And through that, we all benefit and we can grow together.
Obviously, I share that view, Derek, but and I am often accused of being too pessimistic about the future. But it does seem to me that achieving this, a more just world, it's not just in South Africa, but achieving a more just world becomes more difficult as we bump up against the limits to growth in terms of our total global environment. We know there are problems about greenhouse gases and the consequences in climate change. Food security, I think, is going to become an increasing problem. We've polluted a lot of our environment with plastic. There's almost a kind of perfect storm, isn't there, in which dealing with these issues of justice become much more difficult. And I wanted to kind of end today, Derek, by asking you what your experience. I mean, when you were in the ANC in those early years, when you were a bit younger than you are now, you had a lot of experience of campaigning in very difficult and frankly dangerous circumstances. A lot of your colleagues were killed or imprisoned. What would you say to young people now about how to change the world and get more justice, given that I think it may actually be more difficult now than it was when you and I were young?
Well, in some ways, yes, you're right, Harold. In some ways, it is more difficult. I spent almost 3 years in prison myself, and I'm not encouraging young people to try to replicate my experience and Nelson Mandela's experience. Try to stay out of prison, but remain the activist. But the target of your activism is obviously something quite different. So there's there's a law there are laws which protect you, and there's a constitution which protects people. But the consciousness doesn't arise out of the constitution. So what we want is younger people to be much more conscious of, going back to our very early discussion, that is about the inequalities in society, the racism that is still there, prejudice that is still there, and the other side is the environment. To be more conscious of carbon footprint, to be conscious of the impact of climate change, and to be more conscious of things like plastics. I mean, the interesting thing is, if we focus our minds and young people's minds, and clearly we need to focus on education and consciousness raising, we can do things that make the tourism that is post-COVID-19 a more responsible tourism, and encourage not just more responsible tourist establishments, but more responsible tourists, and an environment that is more conducive. For example, plastics. It is a massive problem, but it's also a massive opportunity. If you had a very big program that said on recycling plastics, reusing plastics, making art out of plastics, if, for example, Harold, if every hotel in the country had a recycled piece of art in the hotel room for sale, as soon as it's sold, another one replaces it. You could create a huge market for recycled plastic products. And that is just one of many, many examples of innovative thinking that we need to say, well, actually, these are the big challenges. What can we do to mitigate and to reduce the impact, to minimize our carbon footprint? And what can we do to clean up our environment? And in cleaning it up, we're boosting tourism at the same time. So the tourism itself can be the catalyst. And in doing the right things with the tourists and for tourism, it can further grow tourism and grow responsible tourism.
I think it's absolutely true, Derek, that many people, because they're on holiday, because they're in a different environment, because their eyes are open, they see opportunities and ways of doing things that they don't see at home, even if those things are happening at home. There's a real opportunity to introduce people to make the change. Could we just end with maybe some thoughts about what you would say to people who want to come and visit South Africa? What would you say to the tourist, to the visitor?
Okay, well, firstly, I'm not yet a registered tour guide, but I'd be delighted to take a visitor or two on a trip to Robben Island or a trip to Hanelkom. So but that's just on the lighter note. I think, interestingly, in the post-COVID-19 period, I mean, probably immediately people are going to be a little bit cautious about travel on the one hand. On the other hand, people will not have traveled for quite some time. some of the bookings that were made were deferred bookings, so they will still continue after COVID-19. I think South Africa's profile, if anything, although COVID-19 has had considerable impact on South Africa, we've shown that we've dealt with the pandemic in a very responsible way, and we have great escapes, by the way. If you are a little bit cautious about pandemics and about infection, to go to a lodge, as opposed to going to a hotel, go to a lodge where you have isolated rooms, where you're not necessarily up and down stairs brushing against people. You can have your food served in those lodges. Well, South Africa has a plethora of lodges. So there are very few countries in the world per capita that would have as many lodges with that sort of that protected environment, or relatively protected environment, that South Africa has. So South Africa is a good place to visit post-COVID-19, especially if you are still a little bit nervous. And of course, the offer, I needn't repeat that, Harold. We have a truly magnificent offer, very diverse. There's something for everybody. And, you know, that's it. You know, we have a truly wonderful offer. And so I would invite people to really consider coming to South Africa during the COVID-19 period.
I'd only want to add one thing to that, Derek, which is if you go to South Africa, do not miss the cultural township tourism experience, which is unlike anything that you can find almost anywhere else in the world. And if you take the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, which still a lot of tour operators don't feature, Derek, if that District 6 Museum was in New York, it would be the top attraction in New York. It is a world-class destination. And yet many people go to South Africa and never visit it. And I think that's a real shame, because that's a real monument to the durability of the human spirit and the willingness to work together for justice. And what's happening on that land now around the museum is a real testament to the success of South Africa post-apartheid, I think.
You're absolutely right. So, I mean, the District 6 Museum, you can include a number of other museums, but
sure.
it does occupy a particular space, because the symbolism of the District 6 removals right next to the heart of Cape Town, and that land standing barren, the only remaining buildings there were mosques and churches, and a difficult forced removal case to resolve. As it happens, District 6 occupies a very important space in my life, because you'll see a photograph of myself with the claimants, because back in 1994, I was the Minister of Land Affairs. So it was a long route. It wasn't easy getting people to agree on the nature of the compensation that is to be paid, who would be able to return to District 6. Obviously, so many years later, people have made lives in other parts of the country or in other townships, and are not able to move, or don't at this stage want to move. But there has to be some kind of compensation and opportunity created. And you're quite right, Harold. It's a magnificent success story. But you will have to tell me what we're doing wrong. Why aren't we getting more people to go to the District 6 Museum? Because I'm not sure. I don't have the answer to that myself.
Well, a couple of thoughts. I mean, but one personal reflection first. I would never have visited South Africa under apartheid. Simply refused to go. And my father wanted to migrate to South Africa, and I refused to go with him, which means he didn't. So for me to go into the District 6 Museum and realize that that had been happening while I was at school, that it happened during my lifetime, that forced clearance, was a really, I have to say, shocking experience for me. But part of the problem is that many of the people who offer tours to South Africa through local companies in South Africa are not told that the District 6 Museum exists. And that brings us back in a way, Derek, to the Black Lives Matter movement, doesn't it? Because, you know, it's a sense in which people want to airbrush things out of their history. The number of people who told me that really there ought to be some new houses built on the edge of that township as you come in from the airport to Cape Town, in order that the tourist doesn't see the township. That kind of Potemkinization of tourism really needs to be avoided. And to be fair, South Africa has avoided that. But the pressure is there from many of the bigger operators all the time for those tidying up movements to take place. And thank goodness that they've not taken place.
Well, Harold, I know we're coming to the end of our interview, but you're just raising such important issues that, if I may just respond
Please
briefly,
do.
there's this word, and it is in our latest tourism strategy, which is not a replacement of the 1996 white paper, and it talks about the pillars that are necessary for the growth of tourism and inclusive growth of tourism, and it includes the word transformation. And the word transformation, has a particular meaning in South Africa and significance and importance. So for many people, it says, oh, it's a threat. Transformation is a threat because it means opportunities will be created for Black people and white people will be denied opportunity, and that is not what it's about. So if for example, if you look at the landscape, it's clearly that we have in South Africa, and if you look at the economy of South Africa, it's clearly the legacy of apartheid, and largely determined by the exclusion of a number of people during the apartheid period. So tour operators, the same thing, tour guides, the same thing. As you embark on a transformation exercise, and you get more trained Black people to be tour operators and resourced, and you get more Black tour guides, inevitably the places that a number of the guides currently don't include in the itinerary are much more likely to be included in the itinerary. Not just the District 6 Museum, but the Hector Peterson Museum in Soweto, where we've just recently commemorated the tragic events of June the 16th. We call it Youth Day. And these are very, very important places of memory. But as I said, if the landscape doesn't change, the propensity and desire to, or even inclination to include some of these sites in the tourism experience remains limited.
I think what people forget in South Africa, not people like you, Derek, but some people forget that for the international visitor, they're looking for that inspiration. They're looking for the hope that South Africa represents. Yes. And really, I think more should be made of that in the way in which South Africa is presented to the world. South Africa is far from being perfect, but it's an inspiring story about how real change can be made from really a very difficult past. Derek, can I thank you? I'm going to take you up on that offer to guide me next time I'm in South Africa, and certainly for WTM Africa next year, I'd very much like to have you on a panel and discuss some of these issues in more depth then. But if I could just say a really big thank you for your time this morning. Thank you.
And we'll do the next interview either on Robben Island or at Marupeng. We'll do it on site, not via Zoom.
That would be absolutely splendid. I shall look forward very much to that, Derek. Thanks for your time this morning. Thank you.
Thanks.